Hello and welcome to week 3 of AB 606. This week we're going to be covering code 3.0. Luckily this is a shorter section of the code than the other ones that we'll be covering. As you can see, we only have about one page. Now, it does look very short, but I can tell you because the topic is behavior assessment, it is a frequent area of ethical concern. So it will be a little bit shorter this week, but there's still quite a bit of ground to cover. So again, because this is shorter, we're only going to spend 1 week on this section of the code. All the other sections we'll be spending 2 weeks on. But as I said, there's frequent ethical issues in the field in regards to assessment. And this can be a sticky ethical area because it usually happens with other team members, adults, parents that are very stressed out, that are very emotional, because when you're called in to do a behavior assessment, there's usually some significant problem behavior. And that can mean safety issues for you, for everyone else, and stress issues. So when dealing with these kind of behaviors, other professionals and parents, caregivers, guardians, individuals are usually not in a very rational place. I shouldn't say usually, but can often be in a kind of a desperate position, which is understandable given some of the severity of the behavior. So starting with 3.01, behavior analytic assessment. It's a short section, but we'll be spending most of our time talking about this. It states that behavior analysts conduct assessments prior to making recommendations or developing a behavior change program. When behavior analysts are conducting a behavior reduction program, they must first conduct a functional assessment. So we're really going to dig into that last very prescriptive sentence there because it uses strong words. When conducting a behavior reduction program, something we do all the time, you must first conduct a functional assessment. When you're in the field, you will be asked to develop a behavior reduction program right away at some point in your career. You're going to come in and someone is like, we need this behavior gone yesterday. Tell us what to do right now. Unfortunately, this happens a lot, whereas, we would, in a perfect world, when a minor problem develops at a young age, or when it's not that severe, that individual would receive behavior reduction, programming right away. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen that way. And it's not parents' fault, it's not individuals' fault, it's not schools' fault. Unfortunately, the funding is often set up in such a way that you don't qualify for behavior reduction programming until it reaches a certain threshold, which is very unfortunate because at that point it just becomes more difficult to actually reduce. So it's really oftentimes you won't find out about it until it's a safety issue. So when this happens, and somebody comes to you and says, we need a behavior reduction plan right now, you're going to have to convince all the parties that you have to complete a functional assessment before you can develop and implement a behavior change program. This, of all the things we'll talk about, takes a lot of skills and clout because they're not going to want to hear about the ethical code in that situation. I mean, I've had people say it's unethical not to intervene immediately, which, is understandable. But that's where it takes really good communication skills to help them understand that, look, I could develop something right away. One, it would be unethical and be violating my code of conduct. But also, it's probably not going to be effective because you need to know what the function of the behavior is. And so there's really even if you were to do it, it probably wouldn't be effective. But do be prepared for a lot of pressure. Um, Professional pressure can be threats to your job, being reprimanded by employers, or being perceived as not a team player. When you get called in to the team to, you know, whether it's an in-home support team or in a school or in a residential placement, they bring you in because they want you to fix the problem behavior. And if you don't, you, might get some of the pressure from your superiors, and also your colleagues might see you as, oh, they're not easy to work with, not a team player. And that's just pressure because they want you to fix something right away. Whereas we all know that, well, if you would have dealt with this very early on, we wouldn't be in the situation to be in such a rush. You'll also experience personal pressure, and that can come in the form of emotional appeals from those involved. And these are very genuine and convincing because they really need help. And as I said, you could be accused of being unethical by not acting immediately to end a dangerous or disruptive behavior. Um, so that's kind of the pushback that you get. But luckily, we have some more options. So talk about what a functional assessment really is. Um, that's the words that are used, the specific terms that are used in the code. So we need to figure out exactly what they mean by functional assessment, because as you know from your coursework, functional behavior assessments, functional assessment, direct, indirect, functional analysis, there's a lot of different types. So let's get our terms straight first. So there are three types of functional assessments or functional behavior assessments. Functional analysis, which is, of course, experimental design and manipulating variables with our analogs. That is the most complex and the most accurate. Less complex and less accurate is the descriptive assessment, where we do observe and measure data and make correlations. So, most of the time when the problem behavior, it's followed by this and preceded by this. So we look at our ABC data. And then our least complex and least accurate is the indirect assessment. So that is obtaining information from others who are familiar with that individual. So those are, when you sit down and do the FAST, the functional analysis screening tool, or the QABF, the questions about behavioral function, and you really just sit down and ask lots of, semi-structured interview questions to try to get at the function. So it's important, as I said, to note that the ethical code does not require functional analysis or even necessarily a descriptive assessment. While normally we want those two, almost always we want at least some descriptive data in our functional assessments. An indirect assessment, as the terms are used, is compliant. So when you get into these situations where there's pressure and safety issues, and you really want to put something in place right away, you do have the option of conducting an indirect assessment quickly so that you can put a behavior plan in place. Now, once you put that in place, then you can conduct a more comprehensive assessment. So in some cases, indirect assessment can be inconclusive, and then in that case, it is not ethical to move forward with a behavior change plan because the assessment was not appropriate. And again, that's going back to this term, the type of which is based on the client and the situation. So if you sit down and you do your indirect assessment and interviews and screening tools, and you really don't have a good hypothesis of what the function is, then you can't implement a behavior change program based on an inconclusive assessment. So that would not be appropriate. In my experience, an indirect assessment usually does yield enough information to develop a hypothesis, which can inform a basic behavior reduction or intervention plan. The key is that once you have more data, that you revise the plan and don't stick with that just initial putting something in place. I mean, usually, honestly, we can, there's not many functions. It's either to get social, to avoid social, to get tangible, to avoid task demands, or sensory blocking or sensory input. So usually we can get at a pretty good guess from indirect assessments. Not always, but usually. And we can put some basic, almost universal supports in place to help promote positive behavior. Okay, so the second part of 3.01 is that behavior analysts have an obligation to collect and graphically display data. Emphasis is mine there because this is something that is important and is not always done. Using behavior analytic conventions in a manner that allows for decisions and recommendations for behavior change program development. So a lot of the people that you're going to work with out in the field who are not BCBAs are not accustomed to graphing or even taking measurable behavior data. You see a lot of averages, anecdotal reports, samples, and just perceptions, subjective descriptions are commonly used to communicate behavior levels and changes. But it is your job to be an ambassador for graphing. So you, not only do you have to graphically display data, I mean, that's very clearly drawn out there, but it's not that other professionals don't like graphs or don't appreciate graphs. Almost 100% of the time, they do appreciate a really good chronological trend data, so where you can see how level has changed over time with especially when other variables are marked in phase change lines and things like that. It's just the other professionals don't have the technological skills often, or maybe they have the technological skills, but they just have never practiced training them. So one of the things that will be really important for you to do as soon as you get out there is whoever you're working with, just head up right away like, look, I expect and I will have graphs for all the behavior decisions that I'm going to make. And so let's all get used to doing some graphs. And you can offer PD training to help others learn how to make graphs and use graphing software such as Excel. It's really, I don't think it's anybody's favorite subject, but, well, I take that back. It might be my favorite subject. I like graphing. I like using spreadsheets. I really like Google Forms and Google Sheets for data collection and analysis and collaboration. So I've done a lot of professional development, both within the school district in which I work and also in the community. And again, you won't see a lot of other professionals, at least in my experience, who do behavior analytic graphs, but almost everybody would like to learn how to make better graphs. And again, as soon as you get into a position and you offer this training to people in PD, professional development, it's going to help avoid ethical dilemmas later when you're sitting in a meeting and there's no graphs and they're trying to make an important decision, based on the data that isn't in a graphical format. So avoid that situation and teach others that you work with to make graphs. And I believe that'll make it much easier for you in the future. Okay, so one sticky subject to another. 3.02 involves medical consultation. So this simply states that behavior analysts recommend seeking a medical consultation if there is any reasonable possibility that a referred behavior is influenced by medical or biological variables. This is probably the most common area of ethics that I deal with as an autism specialist in the school system. And, the more that I read into the specific language in 3.02, the more difficult it can become, unfortunately. Parents and professionals will ask you if they believe they need medical care or medication for a particular issue. It's a natural question to ask. Is it behavioral? Is it biological? Is it medical? Is it neurological? You will be asked that, and it's a really sticky subject. A lot of parents equate medical consultation with medication. And so if you do say, yeah, you might want to get this looked at by a medical professional, you have to be really careful that you're not recommending medication necessarily. So, I mean, the phrasing here, which is any reasonable possibility that a behavior is influenced by medical or biological variables, is really broad and I feel unfortunately vague. It doesn't give a lot of specific guidance to us. Obviously, all behaviors are at least possibly influenced by medical or biological variables to some degree. I mean, we are biological beings. All of our behaviors are based in brain chemistry and physiology. I mean, that doesn't mean that behavioral methodology isn't going to be effective. Not at all. I mean, we are biological beings, but we're also influenced by our environment. It's always an interaction between the two. So when they use any reasonable possibility is that its behavior is influenced by, not caused by, but influenced by, really means to me that, one of the big takeaways is that it is much safer from an ethical perspective to recommend seeking medical attention rather than ruling it out. So based on the wording, it would be really hard to justify telling a parent that no, do not go seek medical consultation, because I don't know how you could be certain. I mean, there'd be a few situations that you could think of, I'm sure, but most of the time it's going to be really hard to rule out that there's a reasonable possibility that a behavior is influenced by a biological variable. It's going to be really hard to rule out. So, really your answer is, it can't hurt to just get it checked out and see if there's any medical or biological variables that are influencing this behavior. When we're talking about eating food, and all the problem behaviors and that can be around food, such as, from one end of the spectrum, which is picky eating and food refusal, to the other end of overeating, pica, and, eating trash and things like that. Obviously, those are quite possibly influenced by a biological variable because it's hunger. There's countless others. Obviously, most sensory seeking behaviors could have some biological, anything involving toilet training. You name it, it's possible, the words that they use, it's possibly influenced by medical. So again, I want to emphasize that, using this wording, you have to be really careful that not to rule out medical consultation. But that does not mean that you're recommending the parent consult about a specific treatment or intervention. You're just having them get a medical consultation to learn more about biological medical influences on the behavior. So you're not going to tell a parent that they should consult with their doctor about getting a laxative, but you should just consult the doctor about medical and biological influences on their constipation or incontinence, for example. Another example, you do not want to advise a parent that they should consult the doctor about ADHD medication, but rather they should consult the doctor about biological medical variables that influence their hyperactivity and attention issues. So, could be a food allergy, could be anything. We do not recommend specific medical interventions, just a medical consultation to see if there are any medical or biological variables. I feel like I'm repeating myself a lot, but it's a very, very fine line, and it's one that is so commonly walked by behavior analysts. So if a parent chooses to consult with a medical provider per your recommendation, it's important to provide them with information to share. So I do this a lot. When we have a very difficult behavior, I'll say, yeah, you might want to talk to your doctor about this, but that's usually not enough, because then they, get an appointment. Then a month later, they're sitting in the doctor's office and they're saying, "What can I do for you today?" Say, "Oh, well, somebody at school said I should talk to you about this," and that doesn't. Sometimes that doesn't go over very well, or at least it's not very productive. So I recommend providing information to the parents that they can share with the medical provider concerning the behavior. You will always, if you're going to share this with the medical provider yourself, you will always need a release of information to do that. Alternatively, you can give the information to parents and parents can hand it to the medical provider. That's the parent's choice, as long as it just depends on who's giving the information to the provider. If you do it, you need a release. But if you give it to the parent and the parent chooses to give it to the medical provider, that's fine. You do not need a release for that in most cases. In my position, I often collaborate with doctors and psychiatrists by providing behavior frequency data, FBAs, and other correlation data such as scatter plots. I've sent videos to doctors before. I really ask them, with the release, like, what information can I give you about this behavior that'll help you understand if there's any medical biological variables? And I have never had a doctor not be enthusiastic about getting some of that data to help them make a decision. And, encourage the parent to have the medical provider contact you if they need additional information. So make sure you give them your card and say if the doctor has any questions about the behavior that we're seeing. And, one thing I've learned is that doctors in medical school, especially now, are really taught that you should not be medicating a student, for example, without behavioral interventions first. So, if a parent goes in, which happens a lot, and then they'll send the parent home, the doctor will send the parent home with a report, and the report will say, pursue behavioral interventions. And we maybe have had intensive behavioral interventions for 3 years. And that can be frustrating because if the doctor had known everything we had done, if they had the FBA, the behavior plan, the accommodations modifications, so on and so forth, then the doctor would say, oh wow, so all this is being done and the behavior is still occurring at this high of a rate. Okay, let's look at some other possibilities. That can be really productive and speed up the process. Okay, so moving on to 3.03, Behavior Analytic Assessment and Consent. A reads, prior to conducting an assessment, behavior analysts must explain to the client the procedures to be used, who will participate, and how the resulting information will be used. Section B, behavior analysts must obtain the client's written approval of the assessment procedures before implementing them. So this part of functional assessment, behavior analytic assessment, is often kind of glossed over in the field when you're doing direct and indirect assessments, because we're always trying to get at function of behavior. So a lot of times we're asking questions, maybe we're going in to observe and take some data. And it's often pretty informal. We're just trying to kind of feel it out, see what's going on. But we need to be really careful. If we're actually conducting an assessment, then we must get written permission from the client, or guardian as appropriate. So it's important to gain that consent even for those indirect assessments, especially when you're going to turn that into a behavior change program. So if you're in there watching and taking notes, or you have somebody, parent or caregiver taking data, if you're going to turn that into a behavior change program that's going to have a big influence on a client's life, you need to explain to them ahead of time what's going on. And unfortunately, I don't think that happens as often as it should. Okay, 3.04, explaining assessment results. Behavior analysts explain assessment results using language and graphic displays of data that are reasonably understandable to the client. So this is kind of one of those soft skills areas that is really, really important. A team or family is not going to implement a really intensive behavior change program if they don't understand the why behind it, why you think this is going to work. So, you can't just sit down, often you cannot just sit down with a team and say, here's the FBA results, here's my behavior plan, do you have any questions? Because you need to step back 4 or 5 steps, and before even going into the specifics of the FBA, you need to explain or find out if they already have an understanding of the functions of behavior. Because without that background of understanding the behavioral view of behavior, that all behaviors have a function, and we have to match the function in our intervention, they're not going to get it. Which is no fault of theirs. It's, we work with individuals of all levels of education, and even there's people with college degrees that have never had any sort of behavioral training. So I really recommend having a little presentation handout that you use for this purpose a lot, and become very fluent and efficient in explaining these concepts to a general audience. This is something we're going to be practicing in this course, which is just explaining in plain terms behavior analytic processes. So, we're kind of going to be practicing this soft skill in general, but I think you'll find that as you get in the field, you need to have kind of a 10-minute, this is what the functions of behavior are, handout, an explanation that you can pull out anytime you need it, before you go over assessment results being one of those times. Okay, so 3.05, consent for client records. This reads that behavior analysts obtain the written consent of the client before obtaining or disclosing client records from or to other sources for assessment purposes. It's good to remember it is pretty redundant with 2.05, 2.06, and 2.08 of the ethical code. It's just it's no different for consent. So make sure you always have consent and disclosure, waiver, whatever you call it, release of information, before you send or disclose any assessment information whatsoever. Okay, well, thank you very much for staying with me. As I said, this week's lecture is a little short. We're just under 30 minutes. This week we do have a quiz over this material. We have 4 weeks left. We're going to spend 2 covering 4.0 and 2 covering 5.0, and then we have our finals week. So thank you very much, and please contact me with any questions.